So bear with me. As a person born at the brink of the collapse of the USSR, I experienced the 90s, which I talked about here on my channel on a few occasions. And I do remember very vividly this one occurrence that did happen a few times. I would observe the elderly, older people, just rummaging through the trash as I was a child. And I remember just being so shocked at seeing this. And I was a child, so I did not know why this was happening. And my parents, they did not help either, because they did not want to educate me, because they were so scared and so anxious for the future that they did not tell me anything. So they pretty much ignored this phenomenon altogether. They didn't say anything disparaging about the people, but they did not say anything to explain why this was happening either. So this memory has become actually one of my core memories, and it's actually something that I'm processing because it is happening again. But now being an adult and having class consciousness and having read Marx, Engels, Lenin, you name it, I have come to finally understand why, as a child, I had this visceral reaction, and I'm able to see the difference that this kind of events made to me, because now I understand that it is not normal that the elderly have to get food out of a trash can because they can't afford to pay for food and there's no one in their life to help them. And I know now that this is not normal, and that's a failure of capitalism. That's a failure of the system that cares about profit and not people. And as a child, of course, I did not know that. And this deep fear and uncertainty that I've had since I was a little child is rooted in seeing events like this and people around me acting as if it was normal. Because in my childhood psyche, it was like, well, it can happen to anyone, right? If you see people just having to scavenge for food as if they're some kind of wild animals and no one around them helping them, that means it's normal. That means that happens in a human society. That means if I become unwanted, I become old, disabled, sick, then this is going to happen to me as well. And of course, in the modern capitalist world, we know that this is the case. It can happen to anyone. And in Russian, we even have the saying, which goes as following: «От сумы до тюрьмы не зарекайся», which can roughly be translated as you cannot be protected from prison or from poverty. And this is a very loose translation. And this is a very old saying. It even has some like old archaic words that we don't use currently anymore. And it is universally understood in capitalist societies that you can become a victim of economic devastation at any given point. Any kind of major life event can struck you with financial disaster, and financial ruin will lead to you basically possibly losing your humanity, because people who have to live on the streets and people who have to look for food as if they're wild animals, this is not human life. This is not what humans have evolved to live like. We have evolved to live in close-knit communities where we take care of each other. And of course, still people can die of disease, can die of starvation if we talk about the olden times. But there was the social guarantee all throughout human history. There has been the social guarantee. Even in the Bible, which I don't want to reference, but I do remember this story quite vividly. The fact that the worst punishment for Jews was ostracism. The worst thing for the Jews was not death, but being ostracized from the community. And I've heard, and I'm not sure if it's an actual biblical story, but I did hear some time ago that Cain, the first murderer, was punished by having murderer written on his forehead by God. And this sign ultimately led to his absolute separation and isolation from the rest of the people. So people seeing that sign were not going to help him ever. So he was bound to be isolated for the rest of his life. So even if he did survive for some time, he probably ended up dying younger and having gone through suffering, because it is very scary to die alone when you know that your fellow men there have food and have shelter, but they are denying you your basic human rights. So even in those olden times, when people held a lot of very backwards beliefs, people still realized that they depended on each other. So my childhood fear, my childhood shock, seeing those elderly people going through the trash because they had nothing to eat, that fear is very, very real for me now. And that fear is very, very real for millions upon millions of people all over the world. But having class consciousness, just as I said before, I understand now that this is not a normal. way of life, that this is not normal to have poor people, to have homeless people, and this is what the Soviet Union did their best to try and eradicate. And we did not have such a poverty issue during the Soviet times. People did receive help. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't ideal, just as I usually say, because people like to think in black and white and think that, oh well, if you're not condemning the Soviet Union, then you must worship it. And no, two things can be true at once. And even though there had been quite a few mistakes that were made by the Soviet governance and the Soviet people themselves, ultimately it achieved so many humanitarian, humane goals that we still are unable to achieve in living in the free, independent country, which is subjecting its elderly to such devastation. And I am now in a position where I can be a more active agent of my own destiny. I'm no longer a child. So nowadays, whenever I see people, especially the elderly, who need help, I try and offer something, even though it's very hard for me because I just want to, sob and just do something to save them. But I know that I can't save everyone, but I do try and give them money if they ask for money. I don't care what they do with the money. They can do whatever they want. They can have fun with the money because they are humans who deserve dignity, who deserve respect. If they want to have a little bit of fun, if they want to do drugs or buy alcohol, that is up to them. I am not a master of these people. I am not here to decide what they do with the money. And even though I don't have much money, I try and share whatever it is I have. But it is so heartbreaking for me to see, especially the elderly, the people who were born in the Soviet Union. They were born with a promise that they would be taken care of. And they worked hard to try and do the same for others. And now they're treated as if they're animals. And people are avoiding to look at them. People come up with all these silly narratives about how, oh, they must have done something bad. They must have not used their money wisely. It doesn't matter if a person doesn't use their money wisely. It doesn't matter if a person has an addiction. It doesn't matter. Nothing takes your basic human rights away. You deserve, as a human, you deserve food and shelter and security and safety and warmth and human connection. And you deserve to be treated as a human and not as an animal. And we should be treating animals better as well. But that is not something that is in the books right now because we cannot even take care of the people. And as I have been processing this, I understand that this is a part of this ancestral trauma, this intergenerational trauma, if you will, that I kind of mentioned before. And I'm almost glad that most of the Second World War or the Great Patriotic War veterans died of old age. I cannot bear the thought that they would have to look through trash to look for food. And I feel this pain, this collective pain that so many of the people in the post-Soviet areas feel as well. This pain of betrayal, this pain of not having made it, this failure that we all collectively feel, this broken dreams, these broken hopes. I can feel it and I can partake in this collective grieving. And unfortunately, because of the freaking propaganda that comes from the West, we are also having to come to terms that we have been lied to in the 80s and the 90s. And even before that, we are having to integrate all of these different pieces of knowledge together in order to make sense of this world. And it's very hard. And unfortunately, it leads many people towards the path of nationalism and ultimately fascism, because when people are afraid, when people are so deathly afraid of being ostracized, when they're afraid that their basic humanity is going to be undermined, they very often seek out ideologies or end up with ideologies that tell them that the in-group is going to take care of them and that all of the fault lies outside. It is the outside group that is being demonized, and that is what fascism has been weaponizing for years and years and years. Ultimately, the fascist ideology deals with this fear of being dehumanized. So deep is this fear that the people decide to dehumanize others first before they get to be dehumanized. And Erich Fromm talks about this in some of his works in The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness that I mentioned before on many occasions, and in Zen Buddhism and psychoanalysis. He also talks about how he believes that fascism is the death cult, is the cult of the desire of a person to die because they cannot bear the fear of not being one with the universe. And of course, this is a very different and kind of an unusual idea, but I do think it is very interesting to look into. But what I am witnessing right now, what I know a lot of people are witnessing in many other places as well, is the fact that people come to the ideas of nationalism and ultimately fascism because they are so deeply afraid of not being within this tight-knit group of people who will accept them, and their humanity therefore becomes conditioned. They believe that they have to prove their humanity, and Erich Fromm talks about this as well in Escape from Freedom. And this video is not to advertise Erich Fromm, but I do appreciate his perspective on a lot of things, bearing in mind that he was a psychoanalyst as well, so he kind of deals with the psychology of trauma as well. I do think that there is a lot of truth in that analysis, because I believe that a child, when they're very, very afraid and no one is there to explain to them why things happen, and no one is there to reassure them that we as a collective of humans are going to take care of each other no matter what, then this child will grow up insecure, and they may project this trauma onto other people, and they may kind of cultivate that thinking process where they will believe in these fake hierarchies, and they will believe in the fact that humans are ultimately evil and greedy, and this is at the core of humanity, and this is why it is normal for people to have poverty, and it is normal for people to beg on the streets, and for the elderly to be starving on the streets. It is normal for them, because this is something they grew up with. This is something that they have been afraid of, but they are now manifesting it into life. So I encourage everyone to discover what fears you might have, because many of these fears come from the ideology that we live in, and we have the power to change not only the ideology, but the true material condition that create the ideology. We can become active agents that help each other, that do not let the elderly starve on the streets. We can be these people. We can enact that change, and we must do this. And if you have watched until the end, I thank you. I appreciate you. I hope you have a great day today. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Do take care of yourself and your communities first, and I'll talk to you sometime later.